Most people picture Doomsday wrong. They imagine mushroom clouds, fault lines cracking open, some Hollywood disaster where the military rolls in and the president gives a speech. That's not what kills you. The cities that fail fastest aren't the ones that get hit. They're the ones that can't feed themselves 3 days later. Today we're ranking 10 cities by how quickly they go from functional to fatal when the trucks stop rolling, the grid goes dark, and the systems you never think about stop working. If you live in any of these places without an exit plan, you're not a resident. You're a hostage who hasn't met the crisis yet. Before we get into the list, you need to understand what we're scoring. 5 axes of vulnerability. First, water infrastructure. Where does your water come from? How far does it travel? And what happens when the pumps lose power? Second, food supply chain reach. Most cities don't grow food, they import it. We're measuring how many hours of food inventory exist at any given moment. Third, population density versus exit capacity. How many people need to leave versus how many roads actually go somewhere. Fourth, climate and geographic hazard multipliers. Heat, flooding, elevation, seismic activity. The things that turn a bad week into a death sentence. Fifth, documented emergency response history. Not what the plan says on paper. What actually happened last time. Every city on this list scores poorly on at least 3 of these. The top entries score poorly on all 5. Number 10, Houston, Texas. Population roughly 2.3 million in the city proper, over 7 million in the metro. Houston sprawls across more than 670 square miles of coastal plain that sits barely 50 feet above sea level at its highest points. The city was built on bayous, and those bayous flood. That's not a prediction. That's a weather report. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dumped over 60 inches of rain on parts of the metro in 4 days. More than 100,000 homes flooded, over 300,000 vehicles destroyed, 30,000 people needed shelter. The entire city became a lake, and the drainage system that was supposed to prevent exactly that failed, because it was engineered for storms that no longer represent the statistical ceiling. Houston's petrochemical corridor runs through the eastern side of the metro. When Harvey hit, chemical plants lost power, lost containment, and released toxins into floodwater that was already sitting in people's living rooms. Evacuation from Houston is a known failure. In 2005, Hurricane Rita prompted a mass evacuation that killed more people in traffic than the storm itself. 2.5 million people tried to leave on highways designed for a fraction of that volume. People ran out of gas on the freeway in 100-degree heat. If you live in Houston, your exit plan can't start when the storm does. It has to start 48 hours before the first rain band. After that, the roads belong to everyone, and everyone is trying to use the same 3 interstate corridors heading north. Number 9, Phoenix, Arizona. 2.4 million people inside city limits. 5 million in the metro. Phoenix exists because of air conditioning and imported water. Remove either one, and you're living in a place where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The city gets roughly 8 inches of rain per year. Almost all of its water comes from the Colorado River, via a system of canals and aqueducts stretching hundreds of miles. Lake Mead, the reservoir that backs much of that supply, has been in documented decline for over 2 decades. In 2022, it dropped below 30% capacity for the first time since it was filled. Phoenix has no fallback. There is no local aquifer adequate for 5 million people. There is no regional river system to tap. If the canal system fails or the allocation gets cut, you're not rationing water. You're watching a desert city of 5 million people enter a terminal supply crisis in July. The heat alone kills without shelter. Maricopa County recorded over 600 heat-related deaths in 2023. That's with functioning hospitals, air-conditioned homes, and water flowing. Now remove the grid. A prolonged power outage in Phoenix during summer isn't an inconvenience. It's a mass casualty event measured in hours, not days. Your survival window without cooling in a Phoenix summer is brutally short. If you live here, your preparation isn't a go bag. It's a relationship with someone who lives at a lower elevation with natural water access within a single tank of gas. Number 8. Las Vegas, Nevada. Population 650,000 in the city, 2.2 million in the metro. Las Vegas imports roughly 90% of its food by truck. The city produces almost nothing it consumes. Its water comes from Lake Mead. The same source threatening Phoenix delivered through intake pipes that had to be lowered as the water level dropped because the originals were above the surface. Las Vegas has no agricultural fallback. The surrounding geography is basin and range desert. You can't grow your way out of a supply disruption here. You truck in or you do without. The variable most people forget is the tourist population. On any given day, Las Vegas hosts over 300,000 visitors who have no local knowledge, no supplies, no vehicle in many cases, and no plan beyond finding the airport. In a crisis, that transient population becomes a resource drain competing with residents for the same limited food and water. Casinos have backup generators, but those are designed for hours, not weeks. The spectacle dies fast. What remains is a city built on consumption sitting in a desert with a shrinking water source and a population that doubles on weekends. If the trucks stop rolling into Las Vegas, the grocery stores empty in under 48 hours. That's not a worst-case estimate. That's standard just-in-time inventory math applied to a city with no buffer. Number 7. Chicago, Illinois. Population 2.7 million. 9.5 million in the metro. Chicago's failure mode isn't what most people expect. It's not crime. It's not political. It's thermal. Chicago winters routinely drop below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The 1999 heat wave killed over 700 people in 5 days, but cold is the slower, quieter killer, without natural gas heating. A Chicago winter becomes unsurvivable for anyone in an uninsulated structure within 72 hours. Pipes freeze, water stops. The old housing stock in the south and west sides loses heat faster than anywhere else. The Great Lakes sit right there, but proximity to fresh water doesn't mean access to drinkable water at city scale without treatment infrastructure. Lake Michigan is Chicago's source, but it requires pumping, treatment, and distribution. All of that requires power. Chicago also carries deep social fracture lines that have been documented for a century. Resource stress doesn't create those fractures, it accelerates them. In every historical urban crisis, existing inequality becomes the fault line along which survival diverges. The neighborhoods with the fewest resources before the crisis are the ones that collapse first during it. If you live in Chicago, your cold weather preparation isn't about buying a better jacket. It's about knowing where your heat comes from, how long your building retains it without power, and what your backup plan is when the thermostat reads nothing because the furnace stopped 3 days ago. Everything above this line is dangerous. Everything below it is a math problem you lose. The cities from here forward don't just get worse, they get categorically different in how they fail. The margins shrink, the timelines compress, and the gap between prepared and unprepared becomes the gap between walking out and not walking out at all. Number 6. San Francisco, California. Population 870,000. 4.5 million in the Bay Area metro. San Francisco is built on a peninsula. That sounds like a real estate feature until you need to leave in a hurry. The geography creates a natural bottleneck. South is your only land route out, and it funnels through a corridor that's already at capacity during a normal commute. The Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate are your other options, and both are seismically vulnerable structures that may not be standing after the event, most likely to trigger mass evacuation. San Francisco sits on some of the most well-documented liquefaction zones in the country. Parts of the Marina District are built on fill from the 1906 earthquake. In the 1989 Loma Prieta quake, those same blocks collapsed because the ground beneath them turned to liquid. That wasn't a surprise. The geology reports existed. People just chose real estate over seismology. The city's water comes from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in Yosemite, 167 miles away through a system of tunnels and pipes that crosses the Hayward Fault. Seismologists have given the Hayward Fault a roughly 33% chance of producing a major earthquake in the next 30 years. One event severs the waterline, serving 870,000 people. There's no local backup at that scale. The housing density means almost nobody has storage capacity for more than a few days of supplies. Apartments are small, pantries are smaller. The city that celebrates minimalism has optimized itself out of resilience. Your survival here depends on speed, not speed of response, speed of departure. The people who leave before the bridges are questioned, inspected, or closed are the ones who make it out. Everyone who waits for official guidance joins a line that doesn't move. Number 5, Washington, D.C. Population 670,000. Over 6 million in the metro. D.C. is the normalcy bias capital of the country. The people who live here work inside the systems they believe will save them. That's not cynicism. That's documented psychology. Federal employees, contractors, and military-adjacent personnel have the highest measured confidence in institutional response of any urban population. They believe the plan will work because they wrote the plan. Katrina proved what happens to plans. DC sits on the Potomac floodplain, the National Mall floods, Georgetown floods, the metro system, which sits below the water table in multiple sections, floods. But the primary threat isn't geographic, it's strategic. Washington is the most obvious military and political target on the continent. Every adversary's first strike calculus includes this city. That's not hypothetical. That's published doctrine from multiple foreign defense ministries. The surrounding density compounds everything. Northern Virginia, southern Maryland, and the district itself form a continuous population mass. Any crisis in DC generates refugee pressure outward into suburbs that have no capacity to absorb 6 million people trying to leave simultaneously. The roads weren't built for evacuation, they were built for commuting. If you're watching this and mentally running your own city through these criteria, that's the instinct this channel exists for. Subscribe, because next month we're covering the 10 cities that become the safest when everything else falls apart, and the overlap with this list is 0, back to DC. The cruel irony is that the people closest to the emergency response apparatus are the ones most likely to wait for it to activate. By the time FEMA stands up operations, the window for personal evacuation has closed. Your proximity to power doesn't protect you, it sedates you. Number 4. Miami, Florida. Population 440,000. 6.1 million in the metro. Miami's problem isn't a single vulnerability. It's that every system fails simultaneously. Start with elevation. Most of Miami-Dade County sits less than 6 feet above sea level. The bedrock is porous limestone. That means you can't just build seawalls because the ocean doesn't come over them. It comes through the ground beneath them. Saltwater intrusion is already contaminating freshwater wells. That's a slow crisis happening right now, before any catastrophic event. Add hurricanes. Miami sits in the most active hurricane corridor in the Atlantic. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 destroyed over 25,000 homes and left 175,000 people homeless. That was a Category 5 hitting a less developed version of the metro. Today's Miami has more people, more high-rises, and more coastal exposure. The insurance market has already started pricing in the reality that Miami is becoming uninsurable. Carriers are leaving Florida, premiums are tripling, the economic infrastructure is failing before the physical infrastructure does. In a grid-down scenario, Miami's combination of heat, humidity, contaminated water, and mosquito-borne disease creates a health crisis within days. Hospitals lose cooling, medications requiring refrigeration expire. The elderly population, which is substantial, becomes critically vulnerable within the first 72 hours. Hollywood shows you the hurricane, the wind, the rain, the dramatic footage. Reality is what happens 6 days later when the power's still out. The water tastes like salt, and nobody's coming because every road in and out is blocked by debris. If you live in Miami, your plan isn't about surviving the storm. It's about being gone before the storm arrives and not coming back until someone you trust confirms the water is drinkable. Number 3. Los Angeles, California. Population 3.9 million, 13 million in the metro. Los Angeles imports its water from hundreds of miles away through the California Aqueduct and the Los Angeles Aqueduct. The Colorado River supplies a portion. The Sacramento Delta supplies more. All of it travels through infrastructure that crosses seismic zones. The city sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. The San Andreas Fault runs close enough that a major rupture would likely sever multiple supply lines simultaneously. Water, power, natural gas. Los Angeles also burns. The canyon and foothill geography creates fire corridors that channel Santa Ana winds directly into residential areas. The 2018 Woolsey fire burned nearly 100,000 acres and destroyed over 1,500 structures. Fire season now extends nearly year-round, but the failure mode that makes LA uniquely deadly is evacuation math. 13 million people. A freeway system that gridlocks on a normal Tuesday. Mountain passes that serve as the only exits north and east. The 5, the 15, the 14. These aren't escape routes, they're funnels. In a major seismic event, those roads may not even be intact. Overpasses collapse, that's not theory. The 1994 Northridge earthquake dropped sections of the 10 and the 14. Imagine that happening across multiple freeways while 13 million people try to leave. Here's the choice you face. You drive, and you join a parking lot that might not move for days while your fuel gauge drops. Or you walk, and you abandon most of what you're carrying but you actually move. This is the car versus foot calculation. And most people get it wrong because they can't imagine walking away from a vehicle full of supplies. But a car with no gas in a gridlocked city isn't transportation. It's a metal box you chose to sit in while people on foot passed you. If you're in LA, your route out can't depend on freeways. You need surface streets mapped, fuel cached at intermediate points, and a destination locked in before the shaking starts. Number 2, New Orleans, Louisiana, population 383,000, 1.2 million in the metro. New Orleans is the city that already proved everything this list warns about. Katrina wasn't a prediction, it was a demonstration. And the lesson most people took from it was wrong. They think the levees failed. That's true. But the deeper failure was the evacuation. 80% of the city left before the storm. 20% didn't. The 20% who stayed weren't stubborn. They were poor. They were elderly. They were disabled. They were people who didn't own cars in a city that issued a mandatory evacuation order with no public transportation plan to execute it. That's not a weather failure. That's a policy failure documented in real time on live television. New Orleans sits below sea level. Not metaphorically. Literally. The city exists because of a system of pumps that run continuously to keep the water out. There are over 120 pumping stations in the metro area. When those pumps lose power, the city fills. Not flooding from a storm, flooding from gravity. The water is always trying to come back. The chemical corridor running along the Mississippi between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, known locally as Cancer Alley, adds a toxic dimension to any flood event. Industrial facilities lose containment. Floodwater becomes chemical exposure. The air becomes unsafe. Katrina displaced over 1 million people. Many never came back. The city lost over 50% of its population in the immediate aftermath. The people who couldn't leave before the storm couldn't leave after it either. They were trapped on rooftops, in attics, in the Superdome under conditions that the federal government later described as unacceptable. This is where the hardest moral question on this list lives. Not everyone can evacuate. The elderly person on oxygen, the wheelchair user in a second-floor apartment, the single mother with 3 kids and no car. No one left behind is a principle that requires infrastructure to execute. When the infrastructure is the thing that failed, the principle becomes a question without an answer. If you live in New Orleans, your preparation has to account for the possibility that you can't drive out. Boats, elevated rally points, mutual aid networks with people outside the flood zone. The government's plan failed here once already, under the full attention of the national media. The idea that it would work better next time with less attention is the most dangerous assumption you can make. Number 1. New York City, 8.3 million people, 20 million in the metro. This is the one most people expect at the top, but not for the reason that actually makes it the most dangerous. It's not the population density, it's the geometry. New York City is built on islands, Manhattan, Staten Island, Long Island, where Brooklyn and Queens sit. The Bronx is the only borough with a mainland connection. Everything else requires a bridge or a tunnel. There are 21 bridges and 15 tunnels connecting the boroughs. That sounds like a lot until you divide 8.3 million by the actual lane capacity of those crossings during a mass exodus. The math doesn't work. It doesn't come close to working. 3 hours. That's the estimated time before bridge and tunnel access gridlocks completely in a no-notice evacuation scenario. 3 hours for 8.3 million people. Now here's the number that should reframe everything you thought about urban survival. New York City has roughly a 36-hour food supply at any given time. That's not a disaster statistic. That's a Tuesday inventory number. The disaster is what happens at hour 37. The city produces almost no food. It grows nothing at scale. Every calorie arrives by truck, train, or ship. Disrupt the supply chain for 72 hours, and you have a city of over 8 million people with empty grocery stores, no local alternative, and no way to leave fast enough to find food elsewhere. Vertical living compounds this. Above the 6th floor, water pressure fails without electric pumps. Elevators stop. A 30-story residential building becomes a 30-story walk-up with no running water. Residents who sheltered in place expecting restoration find themselves trapped in towers that were designed for convenience, not survival. The subway system, which moves 5.7 million riders on a normal weekday, floods. Yeah, I'm not in a hypothetical. It floods regularly. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 filled multiple tunnels completely, destroyed electrical systems that took months to repair, and demonstrated that the system most New Yorkers depend on for basic mobility is one storm surge away from total shutdown. And here's the cascade. New York doesn't just fail for its own residents. A collapse in the New York metro generates the largest refugee population in the country. Over 20 million people pushing outward into Connecticut, New Jersey, upstate New York and Pennsylvania. Communities with populations in the tens of thousands suddenly absorbing hundreds of thousands. The infrastructure of neighbouring regions buckles under a wave it was never designed to handle. One city's failure becomes a regional systems collapse. The fantasy is that you shelter in place and wait for help. The documented reality is that help in a city of 8 million gets rationed by triage. Your block isn't priority. Your building isn't priority. You're a grid coordinate in a system that's overwhelmed before the first responder finishes their first shift. If you're in New York, your plan has to start before the crisis. Go bag in the closet. 72 hours minimum. A bicycle. Because when the bridges are gridlocked with cars, the pedestrian and bike lanes still move. A destination outside the metro with someone expecting you, and a trigger. A personal threshold that tells you to leave before the official evacuation order, because by the time that order comes, the bridges are already full. The real danger isn't the crisis itself. It's that 8 million people all realize at the same moment that the same 4 bridges are their only way out. Decision paralysis at that scale isn't a psychological curiosity. It's a death mechanism. We started with a simple idea, that the cities people worry about aren't the ones that kill fastest. After 10 entries, the pattern is clear. The most dangerous cities aren't the ones closest to the bomb. They're the ones furthest from their own water. Every city on this list is livable, vibrant, worth loving. But loving where you live and understanding what it requires of you in a crisis are 2 different skills. The real preparation isn't a go bag or a bunker, it's honesty. Honesty about what your city becomes when the things you take for granted stop arriving on schedule. Cities are the greatest achievement of human cooperation. We millions of strangers trusting systems they've never inspected, relying on supply chains they can't see. That trust is what makes civilization work. But trust without awareness is just comfort with a countdown attached. Drop your city in the comments, tell me your exit plan, or tell me why your city should have made this list. I read every single one. Stay informed, stay mobile, and know your roads before you need them.